Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to jump in, but I want to start with some thank yous. Today is the last day of Innovation Week at Mozilla. And for those that have been at other events, it shouldn't be surprising. This is a group effort. You've heard presentations from people from the innovation team and around Mozilla. And you'll hear more of that today, but I want to thank some people that were maybe not on stage. Brittany Crooks and Hyun Choi for doing a lot of the coordination and planning, Constantina and DE for all of the day of planning and bringing everyone together. Thank you so much for that. My colleagues in the Innovation Studio and the wider Mozilla Miko ecosystem, as well as Imo Udam, who's championing innovation at Mozilla. Thanks everyone for all of the effort that goes into this. And I'm very excited to jump in today. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm gonna start with some intros from the panelists here. My name is Thomas Lodato. I'm a designer, researcher, PM, jack of a bunch of trades in the Innovation Studio. And I'm here with 3 panelists that are going to talk about transparency and safety and the trade-offs in AI. Bobby Rakova. Bobby is a senior trustworthy AI fellow at Mozilla Foundation, where she works on generative AI, socio-technical evaluations, and participatory mechanisms. Design that centers on human-centered approaches, equity, access, and consent. She started with the terms we serve with, design fiction, and speculative friction project. Thank you so much for being here, Bobby. Liv Erickson is the ecosystem development lead for Mozilla Innovation, where she focuses on emerging technology strategy and development and policy. She's been working in AI technology since 2015 and is currently working on a project to turn her local computer into an AI insight companion called MemoryCast, which you should have seen earlier this week. I'm assuming that's what you mean. That one. And then Stephen Hood. Stephen is a senior manager for emerging technology at Mozilla, where his current areas of focus are open source AI, including the Llama project and decentralized social media. He previously managed the social bookmarking pioneer Delicious, and co-founded Storium, Blackboard, and Fairspin, and worked on Yahoo Search and WebLogic. Thank you, Stephen, for being here. Okay. So I'm going to jump in with a short presentation just to set the tone for today. All the panelists know about this, so I won't take much of the time on the floor here, but I wanted to just set some the way in which we might talk about transparency and safety today. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see if I can do this without messing this up. Okay. Firefox. It's working. A live event, this is how it goes. Okay, let's see. Constantina, I might need some permissions here.
I'm pretty sure as you're a speaker, you are able to share. We saw something coming up and something left us.
Let me double check. 1 second. That's my mistake, maybe. Okay. It doesn't seem to allow me, so I'm just going to jump right in without the presentation, and we'll talk through it. That's how it goes sometimes. Great. So the panel today is called The Trade-Offs Between Transparency and Safety in AI. In planning for this, it seemed pretty important amongst us that we should wrangle this topic in terms of transparency and safety that we could actually talk about. Right? This could be a pretty wide and amorphous conversation. And so we wanted to focus on the concepts and how they play out in the work that everyone's doing here. So we'll hear about these different frames that we're going to focus on, but really grounded in the work that people are doing. There's the projects that people are working on, people's experiences, so that we can have a conversation about this in a tangible, what it means to actually do transparency and safety and make those trade-offs. With that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about these 2 terms before we jump in. Transparency and safety are 2 of the 5 values that are found in Mozilla Foundation's Trustworthy AI framework. Together with fairness, trust, and privacy, this framework characterizes AI systems that put human agency at the core of how AI could be built and put corporate accountability that is real and enforced. To that end, transparency and safety contribute to 2 sub-goals in the sort of quest for trustworthy and responsible AI. Transparency is there to make systems seeable and knowable, to equate looking into a system with understanding and therefore holding it to account. And secondly, safety is there to reduce harm and exploitation of systems for nefarious ends or exploitation by people or for people, and the exploitation of global resources in creating such systems. If you can visit the page, which would be excerpted here, you can see how this is framed in the principles. The premise of this panel is that safety and transparency require trade-offs. To have one, you must sacrifice the other. But I want to also problematize this for the panelists and for the audience. Under what conditions, for what people, and to what ends does the oppositionality of transparency and safety arise? I hope we can talk about some of that today and try to understand a little bit about why that trade-off even exists to begin with. When we talk about transparency, we also need to just think about the fact that this is a metaphor for looking into a system, and that looking into that system produces knowledge and understanding. Implicated in transparency is knowledge production through various types of means, and for certain people, who is seen and what is seen, the levels of explanation the seer is entitled to and can even understand, the means under which understanding is gained, and the purpose of that insight, and oversight. Something that I found surprising as I was looking into this and preparing for the panel was that transparency, often talked about by experts, is something that they're not able to understand. Quotes from Anthropic, engineers and people at OpenAI talk often about looking at the systems, not really knowing what it's doing or predicting its outcomes. I think this is kind of an interesting point, given the fact that we're talking about it here, that even those people building those foundation models are not quite sure what's being done. That being said, there's been a lot of work in recent months. In October, there's a paper published by Anthropic where it tried to map the neural net to actual inputs and outputs. This is really a glimpse into what it looks like at a technical level, actually looking at systems and trying to understand what they are. But
Thomas, I think I'm sharing your slides now. Can people see that?
Oh.
Can anyone see the slides? No?
It isn't voting.
It won't work? Okay, sorry, I tried.
I know.
Go on.
Some systems are not as transparent as they might seem. Okay. Oh, so I can see the slides. Great. I can't see them, but
well, I'll go ahead and share them. Share them. So those who can see it will be able to.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Of course.
Okay, I am on the slide with the Anthropic image, the screenshot. Is that good?
There, I got it.
Okay. I'm still seeing some dots, but we'll go with it. So this is an example of what I was just talking about. There's work being done to look at this, but this isn't just a technical problem. If you can move to the next slide, there's the Stanford Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Center produced this index of transparency for foundation models. It uses 100 indicators across 3 categories to determine the transparency of foundation models. There's some serious criticisms of this that are out there, but with that withstanding, it's important to also note that these things are not just evaluating whether you can look into the actual model, but how the model is produced, the conditions under which it's being used, and how people understand it. But even seeing can be harmful, and I think this is where this trade-off plays out. As you see here, annotating images, determining the hate speech of systems requires actually looking at examples of it. And these conditions, the working conditions surrounding this, as well as just the cost of actually looking at things that are harmful to train models, has a cost that's human. Likewise, understanding how systems actually work and being able to look into those systems leads to a bunch of challenges. Simon Willison shared this exploit last Friday in his talk around a universal exploit that uses tokens from an open model, Llama, I think Llama 2, and then injects those into other models. And researchers found out that this actually can jailbreak those models into doing things they're not supposed to. So the ability to actually look into some models produces the unsafe outcomes in other models. The screenshot here is a little blurry, but the archive paper is findable through archive if you want to read that or read reporting on it. Okay. Then next, there's also just let me see, sorry, I lost my place. You can switch down to the final slide here. So finally, I want to also just touch on the fact that safety and transparency are enacted. As we see here with this recent Pew study that looks at the place of AI in the workplace, a lot of Americans, this is a survey in America, widely oppose the use of AI by employers, while it doesn't go into the qualitative data here, it does beg some questions about what is the rationale that people have such trouble understanding how these things might get used, especially around things like hiring decisions that have huge impacts on people's lives and the outcomes of their success in the world. So with that,
sorry for stopping you. Sorry, Thomas. Apparently, the screen doesn't load for YouTube. Some of us see it, some of us don't. So, Stephen, can I ask you again to try for the folks that are watching on YouTube? I don't mind not seeing it.
I think we might be done with the slides. Is that correct, Thomas?
Yeah, we're done anyway.
Well,
so apologies, everybody. Technical difficulties.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for trying. Thank you, Constantina. A live event and a live conversation always has, it's like the demo problem, right? You're always going to end up needing bubble gum at the end of the day to stick together. Okay, so just with those ideas in mind, right? Transparency being there for accountability, talking about safety in terms of harms, who and under what conditions. I want to jump into the panel here. And just a note, as we're going through, if folks have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll try to find some time near the end. So I'd like to start off for the panelists. If you could just start by introducing your work and touch on in your work where you've experienced this trade-off between transparency and safety. Maybe I'll voluntold somebody. If Bobby, if you wouldn't mind starting, thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Thomas. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, to give you a brief context, so I'm within the foundation doing trustworthy AI research at the moment, very applied. And before that, I used to be a machine learning engineer, really getting very hands-on building models, and sort of throughout that time working at a big tech company, I got interested in questions around transparency, safety, responsible AI. And I decided to sort of shift careers into that space and make it sort of a job, and worked at a responsible AI team at the time and spent 3 years in the sort of algorithmic auditing space, like where we were doing this kind of large scale risks assessments. And transparency and safety were like critical parts of those audits, right? And how do we do that on bigger scales too? So I got a lot of time to sort of think about these questions also from the perspective of different kinds of stakeholders, right? Within the companies where we're doing the audits, oftentimes we had to coordinate between different teams that would have different sort of definitions and requirements for safety and transparency, as Thomas already sort of articulated, right? Like how there's a lot that goes into what does this really mean for different kinds of people within a company, for users, for different kinds of end users. So I really think that transparency and safety need to be contextualized, right? And we need to study them in a particular context where the technology is deployed, or what researchers call socio-technical context. So my work right now has evolved a lot around how do we think about social norms and agreements around the technology, and like how these and other sort of safety guardrails are being defined, and how can we evolve sort of computational tooling around that, right, such that we make such sort of norms, expectations explicit, right, and allow for communities to create their own sort of norms and agreements. And this is my main project within the Mozilla Foundation, which really sort of is also a critique of terms of service agreements that have sort of failed us in terms of our sort of ability to give meaningful consent when interacting with the technology. And I've really started looking into these kind of consent mechanisms and how do we bring in more sort of computational tooling also around them. And I'll quickly put it in the chat, but that's sort of my main work is around a framework that we call Terms We Serve With, that is a sort of a way to engage your users in sort of co-designing those sort of norms and agreements around an AI model, and within that really define what does transparency and safety really mean for people. I'm excited to go into the discussion, but maybe I'll hand it off to Liv to share.
Yeah. So when I first started working in AI, I was really just consuming APIs from larger organizations. I think that's how a lot of people think about AI. You get the trade-offs of larger models when you're using cloud computing versus what you can get on your own machine. But more recently, I've really been focused on that local generative AI experience. And my understanding of this kind of tension, I guess I'll say, between transparency and safety is really around how to build applications that aren't calling out to external APIs so that they can work on device with data that people might not want to share with large organizations and their partners. My thinking on transparency and safety has evolved a lot at the philosophical level over the past couple of months as a result of that. My work with AI has really centered around how it enables an individual to connect with their world and other people in it. And I think a lot of the time conversations around transparency and safety tend to go to the extremes. And in my opinion, this means, kind of as Bobby was pointing out, a lot of people end up dismissing the social structures and systems that we already have in place in this world to enable that balance of safety and transparency with each other within the communities and the societies that they're a part of. And we start to abstract it away into these really big topics that have a lot of pressure on one particular organization to solve this for every group of potential users who's using their product. And the most tangible way that this ends up in my work in product development is essentially the more information that you give as you're building an AI product to your users, the more transparent you are about the models you're using, the code you're using, how the prompts that you're using, how you are structuring an application to behave in a certain way. The more transparent you are, the more others can take what you're doing and replicate it and learn from it. And if they have a nefarious, or maybe in this case, like a not safe use of that technology in mind, then you are, in some ways enabling that by being really transparent and showcasing that work. And that's kind of at the core of the conversation that we've heard around whether or not releasing like the llama weights was responsible and safe use of AI technologies. That's what we hear a lot in the regulatory conversations around building safe AI is, well, how much information is too much information to be giving people access to? And so I think, over time, my feeling is that these tensions don't have to be trade-offs to the extent that we think about them sometimes. Because communities, again, as Bobby was pointing out, are really defining their own levels of openness and safety with each other. So for me, at the core of these questions, it's a lot about who's responsible for being transparent at what stages, and how they're defining safety for a particular group of users, recognizing it's not going to be the same across the board. And what we're really seeing are these existing power dynamics of private companies that are acting as pseudo-governments to determine what it means to be safe for the global population. And that's something that I think about a lot. So to me, there's this major questions around autonomy and digital literacy that enable transparency and safety within a particular context, and thinking about how to build products really specifically for that give communities those power to be in alignment with the ways the societies have been built over centuries to balance this level of trust and transparency. So I'm excited to dive into this.
Great. So I guess I'll go last here. So this question has come up in my work in a variety of ways, two that I'll touch on here as examples. One is I've represented Mozilla on a few panels alongside people from industry, like people from OpenAI and Stable Diffusion, but also like policymakers. And the topic of discussion has often been this, specifically in the context of open source. Does open source make AI safer or less safe? And it is a spirited debate Mozilla's participated in and continues to. I think that our take tends to be that on the balance, the transparency afforded by open source makes safety possible or more possible. And that without it, it probably remains elusive. Because if you can't inspect a technology, particularly AI in this case, then you can't really understand it, and therefore you can't really trust it. You can't trust the decisions that went into making it, which are not just technical and scientific. Sometimes they are value judgments and policy decisions that can have effect. So that's a topic that has come up quite a bit in my work. Another example is the practical decision of which models to use, which ones to support in the projects that I work on. And this is a multi-dimensional decision. There's questions of licensing and the provenance of the material that was used to train the models and all kinds of other things. But the one I'll focus on here is the topic of guardrails, which are moderation mechanisms that are often built into a model by the model's maker to prevent it from answering certain types of questions or providing certain types of answers, usually in the spirit of safety. And so this is a great example of the tension between transparency and safety, because these mechanisms are usually not disclosed, right? They're usually not described to you. Even like Llama 2 came out and had much more permissive usage licensing terms attached to it than its predecessor, but exhibited far more careful, I will say, I'll use the word careful, of a mindset in how it answers questions. It would refuse to answer lots of things, would clam up instantly, like at the sight of blood, metaphorically speaking. And so, but that was not really explained or documented anywhere. Most model makers are not doing that. There's no standard way to do that. It may be difficult technically to do that, to express to someone what you did to the model in the cause of safety. So that's another interesting trade-off, and it's an example also of a trade-off that I wonder if it's actually necessary.
Thank you all for jumping in. I want to follow up on a few points and jump in on this conversation around responsibility that came up through each of the things you brought up. So one thing that you all mentioned, and I think is maybe underlying this, is the use of foundation models in other applications, services, techniques, and whatnot, right? When the discussion around safety and transparency has been focused on, one of the focuses often on the foundation model makers. But I'd like to actually talk about the people using those foundation models. Steven just mentioned this, Liv mentioned this, Bobby has experience with this. Like, what does it mean to be on top of that? Where does transparency and safety come into play there? What are the decisions happening at that level that are not necessarily happening at the level of the foundation model, or that because you don't have access to it, you have to make different decisions, different sort of considerations? I'll open the floor, whoever wants to jump in first on that one.
I can speak from a personal perspective here, is that one of the things that I'm evaluating on a personal level when choosing models to experiment and explore is we don't really have alignment as a society around the ethical collection of the data that went into training these models. So there's a really good, the research paper on foundation models that came out of the Stanford lab outlines a lot of challenges with the inherited biases of downstream models who are building on top of foundation models. So there is a challenge around, auditing the sources and understanding the perspectives that were put into these models to begin with. But there's also this larger, to me, ethical question of like, where do I fall on whether or not training on top of everybody's data on the internet was an ethical decision to begin with. And that's at the heart of a lot of copyright conversations happening in the US right now. So that challenge around transparency is I can only be as transparent as a developer or a product manager for something I'm building as the original model creator was. And even if I have access to all of those sources, I have to either trust that, the paper, I was recently reading a paper about the model that I use in my project and looking at the sources and what it was trained on. And it's like super helpful to get that level of transparency, but you'll still see lines that say things like, we got permission from as many places as we could. And it's like, what percentage of your data was that? And that is this, not to overuse the term like foundation, but that's at the foundation of all of these AI apps, is this question of who actually is benefiting from the information that went in to just make it possible to do all of these things that we're seeing now with language generation and other types of generation.
To add real quick to what Liv was already highlighting, I think that when I think about responsibility and these trade-offs, I often think about responsibility, literally the ability to respond. So when you're building your product, right, and prototyping, I mean, how are we designing ways for people to respond, literally, right? Like both in terms of, give us feedback, right? Feedback loops, right? And like, there's so many ways in which we're sort of used to certain kind of feedback mechanisms, like on the internet already, but like, are those good enough, right? Like, how could we create better feedback loops and add in what people call design friction that could enable new kinds of feedback, both in terms of the benefits, like what users like the most, and also challenges or something that people find concerning, or hallucinations, like you name it, like so many other sort of risks and potential biases that we also, like as developers, we want to hear about, right? Because it is really about that sort of feedback loop that's creating that responsibility literally with our users. But just to throw that in there.
I'll just briefly add the idea of responsibility and guardrails is a really interesting question I think a lot about. I think if you are a corporation who has a obligation to your shareholders and your users and to the law, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, it is entirely reasonable and perhaps necessary for you to have guardrails on any AI product that you put into the hands of people. And so I understand why Llama 2 is so gosh darn careful about what it wants to say, right? I understand why people do that, and I think it's actually probably correct. I think the balance of responsibility changes, though, in different contexts and different use cases. You know, if I'm a researcher or a developer trying to advance the state of the art, those moderation mechanisms, those guardrails get in the way of my work because they are a level of curation decision making that I didn't have access to and I can't inspect and I can't change. And this is why you see people actually actively trying to fine tune or retrain the guardrails out of some of these open models. And it's easy to assume on the surface that the intent there is nefarious. I really want, you know, the lulls to come out of my AI. You know, I really I really want to be naughty in some way or do something bad. But I think that oversimplifies. I think that there are probably valid reasons to have models that don't have these guardrails. The question then is, what is your responsibility with those and deploy those and give those to people? And at the end of the day, I'm not sure it's terribly different from the sorts of considerations that um, social media companies and people who run content platforms have to make. You know, there are practical considerations in the name of safety for users and for society that have to be considered. So it is complicated.
I kind of want to pick up on a thread that came up already. I think Liv, you raised this around social norms that exist already that maybe we're not pulling on into the AI space. Stephen, you just touched on this with social media, right? Practices that we see with content moderation. So I'm curious if you could reflect on this as a group. What are some of these, norms that we are seeing elsewhere that we don't see in AI that stand out to you as maybe being relevant here, or things that maybe are unique challenges that are coming to this space around trying to be safe, around disclosure, around being, responsible as an organization? The AI seems to somehow break our brain around.
I don't know that it's unique to AI. I mean, I think like Stephen just said, social media has kind of been dealing with some of these challenges. I think the often quoted phrase of like move fast and break things is well adopted in tech. So like thinking about the practices that we have from society, I think about how we naturally share more or less personal information about ourselves, depending on how close we are to someone, the relationship that we have with them in the context of that. And with AI, there's really not a lot of nuance around that. You're sending information and conversation usually into a system that you have to trust is built in a way that is going to preserve your information and keep it safe. Although, as Simon pointed out in his talk last week with prompt injection, there really is no known way right now to keep data from leaking with these prompt injection attacks. And so I think that this is not, like I said, not unique to AI. I think AI is accelerating that because we see this huge market push and market pressure for everyone to move really fast and be like, well, they haven't figured it out yet, so it's okay that we haven't figured it out yet, but we still want to get to market and get feedback. I was at a talk at Columbia University a few weeks ago where someone pointed out that like software companies used to have really long QA cycles before they ship software. And we are now doing QA for all of these AI companies who are deploying things and getting feedback and expected to iterate really quickly. And that's just become the norm. Whereas I think there's still a lot of places where taking the time to figure out what are the outcomes of this, how are we auditing it, how are we making sure that we are complying with regulation, how do we have checks and balances on who's writing that regulation, are kind of fuzzy in the AI space right now. And I think we really have to take a step back and be like, why do we think that the solution in the AI space is specifically to decide like anything that's trained on more than 10 to the power of 25 teraflops is the right size to regulate a particular way. And their responsibility is to implement these guardrails to keep people from searching for malicious information, and not, you know, why are people searching for malicious information? What are the harms that are happening in society that are making people feel like that's something they need to understand and like act on? So it's this kind of uncomfortable socioeconomic lens that I think comes into play here for AI in particular, because it is this like really hot spot for investment and for building products and services that's just really inheriting a lot of the things we've already been struggling with in tech.
I would add to that, Liv, that was great. Just a quick little side note that occurred to me. You talked about, Thomas, like how does this break our brains? You know, one way it breaks our brains is we're going out of our way to make these things seem like people. Like they say you know, we name them after Claude Shannon. Like we go out of our way to try to anthropomorphize these things. We talk to them through a conversational interface. And there's a lot of value in that, I think, but it primes our brains to respond in different ways, to see it as being fundamentally different from other technologies. And it is, but maybe in some ways it's not, right? In some ways, many of the lessons we've learned about how to manage this stuff can still apply. I just wanted to add that observation.
Bobby, would you like to add anything? I don't want to move on. If you like.
Yeah, happy to move on. Maybe briefly, for me, thinking about the trade-offs, right, that you're making with regards to transparency and safety, it's really important. Like, how do you do that in a way that engages your users, right, or the people that are like at the end of the day, like you're serving with the product you're building, right? Because oftentimes these different metrics that we use within like responsible AI or algorithmic auditing, they're in friction with each other. Like you can satisfy, for example, in the context of fairness, there are more than 20 different metrics that you can track, and no 3 of them can be all satisfied at the same time, right? So you really need to pick like fair to whom, right? And like lots of details, like I'm generalizing, but a lot of these metrics that you end up measuring will be in friction with each other, and kind of making those trade-offs in a transparent way could really help you in sort of communicate to your users, right, about what are those trade-offs that you're making as a developer.
It's a great point. I think with regards to metrics, I recently was listening to a podcast where someone just said the evaluation should be, does it lie or not, right? Like there's many ways we could think about these things and what we expect out of them. That's a great point about maybe these aren't measuring what we need to be measuring. Something you all sort of touched on in this sort of cycle here was sort of both the fact that there's existing mechanisms and things that aren't the case that, you know, we need to maybe think about differently, right? They just respond as humans. It makes me sort of think about this issue about like what is safe or transparent enough, right? If we think of move fast, break things, I think Stephen, you put it YOLO as a dev strategy, right? We talk about these things as human. What does it mean in this context to actually ship something? Under what conditions is that acceptable, that it can be safe or transparent? Are there certain contexts that we shouldn't be shipping things in? Should we take longer dev cycles? Should we not use lean? I mean, I'm kind of curious about like how we make these things, and then also the ways in which we expect them to be, and also how we communicate to people about what is safe, what is transparent enough in this context.
Yeah, it's not very accelerationist of you, Thomas.
Oh boy, I'm exposed. If no one wants
to go first.
Yeah, okay, please do. If this is dead in the water, we can also move on too.
I thought Stephen was saying he was going to go first.
Oh, sorry, I was saying I'd let someone else go, but I'm happy
Yeah.
to go. My quick comment just is that I expect we will have to figure this out as we go along, and our attitudes will change. Right now it's like this Wild West mentality, for better or worse, where it's all about speed, to the point where it's a philosophical point among a certain portion of Silicon Valley, actually a rather large portion of Silicon Valley. I think it was I forget who it was who coined the term reluctant accelerationist recently. But like that's sort of a great term, right? Which is like, this stuff really should advance because it could have a lot of positive impact, but I'm nervous about it. But if we slow it down, it could be hobbled. So I guess I'm on board to go faster. Like this sort of philosophical muddiness and battle is going to play out, I think, here over the coming months and maybe even years. And it's going to change the way people build products and software. I think for me, the big thing is that when you build products with AI, their behavior is not deterministic. It is emergent. Like you literally can't build software the same way that we used to because you actually don't know how it's going to work until you start using it. And one little test suite is not actually necessarily going to be sufficient for you to capture that behavior and understand it. So I guess my answer in summary then is like we have to build new systems and new processes for how we build these products and decide that they are ready.
For me, there's this shift of let's build something that starts small and specialized rather than starting with this idea of building a model that is capable of doing like so many different things that you might want to do. So you just ask it anything and it can figure out how to navigate between all of these different hosted services to get you an answer. So that's been my approach in building AI. I mentioned I do it all locally. I'm not calling out to external APIs, which means I am behind what the like hottest, biggest capabilities are going to be. I'm still running a project from a few months ago. I'm using a model format that's been declared deprecated because there's been advancements in the format of the models, like in the file extensions. But working at that pace has allowed me to hyper focus on like one really specific type of output that is not capable of generating like massive amounts of text. It's not capable of like just calling out to the internet to call in whatever information is the newest, greatest thing. It's this very big shift of what reasonably do I expect a computer to be able to do within what I as an individual or my community feels like is an appropriate amount of oversight for a computer to have on our day-to-day lives. Because at the end of the day, I think we get really excited about this word intelligence and start to forget that a lot of this it's statistics. It's really nicely wrapped, very powerful statistics with an interface that feels extraordinarily human. And we don't have to make that the default way that we build this type of software or incorporate it into our lives. Like there are other options that aren't to build increasingly powerful machines that can essentially do anything on paper that a human can do. Because again, it's a statistic, it ends up being a statistical average with a little bit of randomness injected in, depending on the query or the prompt or which models you're using, the data fine tuning. But as we've already heard, even that does not protect you from using exploits that work on completely different models. So there are patterns that will be problematic with if we're all designing the software the same way to do general purpose tasks all the time. And I opened in the chat with my comment on my philosophy being like droids in Star Wars, where it's like there are some mass-produced droids that do very specific tasks for very specific people or are generalized. And there are also the people who sit at home and they build their own droids and they give their droids the personality that they want them to have and the like tasks they want them to be able to be completing. And it's within the context of them as an individual. It's within the context of the world they inhabit, the planet they're on, the use of the droid. And for me, that's a really compelling model for AI because you can look at this and say, okay, what do I want to build for me And that personalized, like heavily personalized, can be as weird as you want it to be. It's running locally on my machine, so I'm not shipping something as a service out that needs to be able to perform a certain way for every single context. It's a very different way of thinking about software than what we've seen emerging through the SaaS and subscription model over the course of the last several years. And to me, that's actually really exciting because it can be really creative and fun.
So we are coming up close to the time, and I wanted to at least look for some questions from the audience, if that's okay with folks. There's one here that I wanted to pull in the Discord. If there's ones in YouTube, please send them my way. Which asks, do you think it's possible for the power and convenience of cloud-hosted models to ever outweigh our very real concerns about privacy and safety, even for folks who are very sensitive to such risks? It says, what incredible feature would OpenAI have to offer, one only possible with its immense computing resources available, in order for you to use an OpenAI product? I'll leave that to the group if anyone wants to jump in there. So the question is, like, what are we using these cloud services for and risking safety and privacy? Do they ever outweigh each other?
Yeah, I can jump in real quick about maybe coming back to that point about how all of these sort of concepts around transparency and safety and others need to be contextualized. And I think this is where, as we're thinking more about, as you mentioned in your great question, right, around kind of what incredible feature, right, could a model have? But I think at the end of the day, like when we think about that sort of context within which a person interacts with our model, right, it's oftentimes it's really different for different kind of people in different kind of contexts. And I think it's also a lot about this sort of literacy piece that Liv mentioned in the very beginning, right? Like, how do we really kind of educate and improve transparency around the concerns and risks and harms around privacy and safety? And how do we better build products, right, that can really meaningfully articulate those risks to users so that they're better aware of where things can go wrong and what can we do when things go wrong? Thanks for that question.
I think we are 1 minute out. So I'll close with one last question for you all. As we close out here, are there any last minute thoughts you have about transparency, safety, and this trade-off that you want to share? We'll say 1 to 2 sentences, anything that sums up ideas that you shared today. I realize it's maybe a steep request, but if you don't, you can just pass it off.
I can go. I would say that in spending time in among developers in the open source community lately, I definitely noticed the move fast, break things mentality, and sort of a lack of focus on both transparency and safety. And what I would like to see, what I would hope would happen is that as we mature in our use of these technologies and our awareness of their impact on users, that both of those issues come into common discussion more regularly, not just among the big companies, but among the independent and open source development community. And I think that they have significant things to add to the conversation to help us find that balance on this question in a variety of different dimensions.
Sentences. The first, consider safety and transparency of AI in the context of greater socioeconomic dynamics that exist. And the second one is hold stakeholders accountable to being more balanced in their analysis and separated because of the risks of self-regulatory fallacy and what can come out of that.
And for me, think about evaluation methods that are like metrics, frameworks, guardrails, right, around transparency and safety that are really contextualized around the particular domain and context within which you imagine and your users are interacting with your models. And then how do we also center users' values, right? And how do we help our users even know what are their values in that interaction, right? So adding in a form of design friction that really enables that could create these kind of new feedback loops to even help us better understand and advocate for what is transparency and safety.
Wonderful. Bobby, Liv, Stephen, thank you so much today for talking about your thoughts, sharing your insights into transparency and safety and the trade-off. And with that, I'll close this out. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you all.
Thank you everyone for joining. This is the last call of the year, so goodbye everybody. For those of you who are in Europe, just a reminder, Mozilla folks will be in FOSDEM on 2024. Some of us, we have talks there, so join us, come and talk about the projects that we are working on. Steve is the one who's having the talk. So I hope to see the European folks that are joining there. This is the last talk of the year. Thank you very much to everybody. Happy holidays for those of you who have holidays, and hope to see you with more talks next year. Have a good one.